Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 47th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Ron Zoke and David Green. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said in the American media, quote, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories from the week's news that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently. Previous comments are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers and some comments from us, plus articles that we refer to on this show. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Today is November 21st. On this day in 164 BC, Judas Maccabeus, son of Mattathias of the Hasmonean family, restored the temple in Jerusalem. The event is commemorated by the festival of Hanukkah. Virtually all that's known about Judah Maccabee, as he is sometimes called, is contained in the books of the Maccabees and in the works of Flavius Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews, a first-century history. Judas Maccabeus led the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Empire in the 160s of the second century BC. At its height, the Seleucid Empire, founded by one of Alexander's generals, included what is now the Caliphate, ISIS, as you read in the evening news, plus Afghanistan, Pakistan, and much of Turkey. In other words, roughly what the United States is fighting to control these days. Fanatic Israeli attempts to build a third temple on the Temple Mount are part of the modern Israeli oppression of Muslims and Palestinians. Palestinians, of course, are not all Muslims. The Temple Mount, known in Arabic as the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, has been used as a religious site for at least 4 religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Roman religion, and Islam. And if, like the leading student of Judaism and antiquity in the United States, Jacob Neusner, you make a distinction between the religion of ancient Israel and rabbinic Judaism, you could add another religious tradition that has seen the Temple Mount as of great significance. The present site is dominated by 3 monumental structures from the early Umayyad Caliphate in the 7th century AD. That is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and the Dome of the Chain, which are prayer pavilions, basically, all Islamic. So you are watching tonight News from Neptune, a Masking Politics as Religion edition. Today is also the first day of the Salute Festival in Venice, which actually has a bit less politics involved in it than the ones I've been talking about so far. We'll begin tonight with Ron Zoke. What festival are you celebrating, Ron?
The great festival of interpretations of the November 4th election still.
Okay, good.
People are still trying to tell us what it was all about and who actually won and lost. And I wanted to get to, at least briefly, this piece by Frank Luntz, who is a kind of PR propaganda advisor to the Republicans. The midterms were not a Republican revolution, he says. He has lots of focus groups in which he tries out various terms on groups of people, various phrases, and finds out which one will be more effective. with them and changing their minds and probably making them vote Republican. He has an opposite number, by the way, among the Democrats, George Lakoff, who also advises the Democrats on which words to use and not to use and how to frame things when they're trying to persuade the public and so on. Luntz says on election night 1994, as Republicans recaptured the House for the first time, the House of Representatives, in 40 years, I stood in the audience and watched my client, Newt Gingrich, who would soon become Speaker of the House, declare the beginning of the Republican Revolution. And Luntz thinks it's a big mistake to use the word revolution. I knew immediately, he says, that the smartest man I'd ever worked for was making the worst rhetorical blunder of his career. Nobody voted Republican to start a revolution. They did so because they were fed up with a Democratic president, overreaching on health care and government, seemingly incapable of doing even the smallest thing effectively. We all know what happened when Mr. Gingrich tried to turn his rhetoric into action. Sound familiar? No one is saying quite revolution this week, but Republicans across the country in their glee over Tuesday's elections are coming dangerously close to making the same mistake. And he goes on in this vein about what the Republicans need to say in order to get more votes and win more elections. And we're hearing lots of predictions, forecasts about what will happen in 2016 when the demographic trends tend to be, many are saying, against the Republicans in the longer term. And I'm losing interest in this question of partisan advantage and who's going to win and lose on Election Day. But the word from Mr. Luntz, who thinks he knows about public opinion, is aside from a small activist constituency, Americans are not looking for another fight over same-sex marriage or abortion. This isn't to say that voters want their leaders to co-opt their convictions. People are simply tired of identity politics that pit men against women, black against white, wealthy against poor. More than ever, they want leadership that brings us together. This isn't about pride of ownership regarding American progress. This is about progress, period. Americans don't care about Democratic solutions or Republican solutions. They just want common sense solutions that make everyday life just a bit easier. But they can't get their houses in order until Washington gets its own house in order. Well, okay, typical centrist statement on that. Next headline, inequality unbelievably gets worse. The New York Times has been running a whole series of articles on this. They're often accused of being liberal, but they're certainly not radical in any sense, and can always be depended upon, I think, to defend the existing order in the USA and Israel and so on. Stephen Ratner, who's a Wall Street figure, says the Democrats' drubbing in the midterm elections was unfortunate at many levels, but particularly because of the prospect of addressing income inequality grows dimmer even as the problem worsens. To only modest notice during the campaign, the Federal Reserve put forth more sobering news about income inequality. Inflation-adjusted earnings of the bottom 90% of Americans fell between 2010 and 2013, with those near the bottom dropping the most. Meanwhile, incomes in the top decile, the top 10%, rose. Perhaps income disparity resonated so little with the politicians because we're inured to a new gilded age, and so on. So I recommend this to you if it sounds like something you'd like to know more about. Meanwhile, what's happening to the poor, meaning people who have to borrow money from month to month, paycheck to paycheck, in order to continue to exist and to work. Another headline, miss a payment, good luck moving that car. The thermometer showed 103.5-degree fever, and her 10-year-old's asthma was flaring up. Mary Bolender, who lives in Las Vegas, needed to get her daughter to an emergency room, but her 2005 Chrysler van would not start. The cause was not a mechanical problem, it was her lender. So now, in order to live, this person borrows money, and she took out a car loan, and she missed a payment on the car loan, and there's a new gimmick. Now, in many places you can't get a loan unless you consent to have what's called a starter interrupt device installed on your car, by which the loan agency, if you miss a payment, even by a few days, can turn off your car so you can't start it. And wherever you are, when they press that button, the car will stop, it will stall, which is extremely dangerous, but they have their rights. Before they can drive off the lot, many subprime borrowers, like Mrs. Bolender, must have their car outfitted with a so-called starter interrupt device, which allows lenders to remotely disable the ignition. Using GPS technology on the devices, the lenders can also track the car's location and movements. Some borrowers say their cars were disabled when they were only a few days behind in their payments, leaving them stranded in dangerous neighborhoods. Others said their cars were shut down while they were idling at stoplights. Some described how they could not take their children to school or to doctor's appointments. One woman in Nevada said their car was shut down while she was driving on the freeway, and so on. So something is wrong. I think this is allowed to happen. If there's time, I want to get to a bigger topic of education and what's being done to promote and to protest the use of various books, textbooks, especially history. And we've been getting news about that from Colorado and from Texas. And I'll come back to that if anyone is interested in hearing about it.
Thank you, Ron. David, you got comments on Luntz Lakoff and inequality?
Well, I would just say that the Democrats have the Republicans right where they want them. The Republicans have the Democrats right where they want them, and the 1% have both the Democrats and Republicans right where it wants them.
That's not a bad way to put it at all, I think.
So that's, you
probably should explain the first two notions, though.
Well, it isn't that at some level, it isn't that each party doesn't want to be successful, that it doesn't want to control the presidency in both houses of Congress. But in a way, that wouldn't be good for the 1% if there was an overwhelming Democratic Party majority, enough in the Senate to overcome this silly super majority requirement that you have to have 60 votes to pass anything. But the system is working fine for the 1% because everybody can throw up their hands and claim they can't do anything, while the real power is behind the scenes, whether it's in the military-industrial complex or the finance complex or whatever complex we want to ascribe ourselves to. This is the way our system works now, and it's increasingly unconvincing that either party wants to make any meaningful changes in that.
I like Frank Zappa's comment that politics is the entertainment branch of the military-industrial complex.
That's quite right. And he made that a long time ago, comment a long time ago, and it was less clear now. The best analyses of this election have been coming from peculiar places. I don't mean to suggest that Messrs. Zook and Green are peculiar places, but the excellent analysis that we've got here is paralleled by the one good column that I've actually seen on it. It comes from a Republican writer for the Houston Chronicle, a fellow called Chris Ladd, this column was so good that it sent me back looking at earlier things he's done, and he's very interesting indeed and worth paying attention to. He writes in regard to the recent past elections. What emerges from the numbers is the continuation of a trend that's been in place for almost two decades. Once again, Republicans are disappearing from the competitive landscape at the national level across the most heavily populated sections of the country, while intensifying their hold on a declining electoral bloc of aging white rural voters. The 2014 election not only continued that doomed pattern, it doubled down on it. As a result, it became apparent from the numbers last week that no Republican candidate has a credible shot at the White House in 2016, and the chance of the GOP holding the Senate for longer than 2 years is precisely zero. Now, this from a guy, as I say, who's been writing about politics for a while, most recently for the Houston Chronicle, where he has a column. But I think that's basically right, and I'm going to put the column on our News from Neptune Facebook page because the details are worth paying attention to. And it leads me to a consideration of the local scene, the Illinois scene, for the Senate. In 2016. Our junior senator, Mark Kirk, is up for re-election, and he's already announced essentially for re-election in 2016. This week warned a Republican warned a Democratic placeholder named Tammy Duckworth against thinking of running against him because, in fact, she actually probably has some support in her congressional district, at least in Illinois. Kirk's seat isn't that solid. And there is a very real chance that he'll be beaten. But if he's beaten by Tammy Duckworth, then we get the same thing, basically. I mean, there's just nothing to choose between them in terms of how they would vote. The only real way to replace Mark Kirk with an interesting senator would be for there to be a conjunction between the Ralph Nader Democrats and the Ron Paul Republicans in Illinois against these two neoliberal candidates. I don't really expect that happening unless perhaps our colleague David Green decides to run for the Senate and goes after those Ralph Nader Democrats and those Ron Paul Republicans. So what do you think, David? Is there a chance?
Gosh, Carl, don't put me on the spot or anything here.
Right.
Well, you know, I mean, the comment is prompted by my horror this morning about reading Kirk's remarks about Tammy Duckworth.
I guess my motto is aim low and shoot high.
Yeah. Right. The latest word seems to be, well, it's in that article you referenced, actually, that Republicans are in a tough spot in 2016. They will have to defend, 20-some Senate seats?
Exactly, right.
And their chances of doing that successfully in a national election are nil. This guy says zero, but that's interesting.
Yeah.
But what the 1% wants is gridlock.
Yep.
What's called gridlock.
Right.
It's not really gridlock. It's really consensus politics of the 1% between this. The Democrats have got their sort of identity politics issues. The Republicans have their basic neoliberal issues, which the Democrats go along with either with perhaps slightly less enthusiasm, but knowing full well who is paying for them. So this is a consensus that's actually, if you look at it a different way, has worked pretty well for quite a long time now. I would trace it back. You could trace it back to the Carter era, but you really want to trace it at least back to the Bill Clinton era.
Yeah.
There was a long article, I guess a book review on one of the listservs about the original brain. What do you call it? The brain behind the Democratic Leadership Council that really shifted the Democratic Party in the beginning of the Clinton era. A guy named Al Fromm, a guy who was well known at that time that I hadn't really thought much about. He's still around, kind of doing what he's doing, and this was a theoretical strategy as to how to move the Democratic Party, quote unquote, to the center. Bill Clinton was the absolute perfect candidate to do that in terms of his Southern roots and his campaign style and his sort of basic ruthlessness. And we're about to have, I fear, we're about to be confronted with Clinton Part 2.
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite right.
Aren't you ready for Hillary?
Yeah, exactly. Huh?
Are we ready for David?
It seems to me that the Clinton administration, which you rightly pick out, David, as being basically the triumph of the neoliberal revolution, in the sense that it followed on so nicely to the Reagan years. The neoliberal response gets underway in the Carter administration, succeeds with the election of the Reagan administration, and succeeds redoubled in spades with the Clinton administration. Margaret Thatcher was once asked what her greatest accomplishment was as prime minister, and she answered promptly, New Labor. What she meant was that the Labor Party, which began life, of course, as a socialist party in the 20th century, the Labor Party under Tony Blair became a neoliberal party, a reflection of what the Tories were doing, just as Bill Clinton's Democrats became a reflection of what the Republicans were doing. I mean, the patterns are really quite close in the two countries, but in each case, what was at stake was the arrival of the conscious neoliberal plan to reassert the control of capital in the American and British governments over against the sort of concessions that capital had to make after the Second World War, the social supports from Social Security to Medicare in America, the attack on that from the 1%, took the form of co-opting the Democratic Party in the U.S. and the Labor Party, so-called New Labor, in Britain. It was a victory across the board. And what we're seeing today, as I think David rightly describes it, is a playing out of those victories. But this is not what we're talking about in politics in America. The whole art of politics is to distract people from what's really going on and pay attention, as it were, to the little man behind the curtain, and not to pay attention to the little man behind the curtain.
Yeah. Side note, that's a fascinating story in itself, the devolution of labor in Britain from the Fabian Club to Tony Blair, which is
exactly right. And it has parallels with the Democrats. There are important differences because of the differences in the societies, but the parallels, particularly in recent years, in the last generation, are embarrassingly bad. And as a result, you had Tony Blair and George Bush, the younger, marching off to war in the Middle East for reasons that were bound up with those domestic politics.
I would add to Ron's concluding comment about debt in the story, a very, I think, enlightening and appalling story of what was happening. This is, again, brings us back to the problem of financial capitalism. The only way that this current neoliberal regime has to make money is off of borrowing and lending money, putting people into debt, securitizing those debts. And I haven't read too much about this, but apparently the automobile debt and loan market is becoming, following the same path as the mortgage market, which with its subprime loans, its securitized loans, making money off of making money, off not producing anything, putting the financial system at risk. I doubt if we're going to have, we're not going to have an automobile bubble the way we had a housing bubble, but you just couldn't. It isn't as big an engine for the economy. But still, this is following along those same paths, and the only solution to it is to shrink the size of the financial aspect of our economy. And in fact, this is absolutely vital. There's no program that can be taken of serious reform that can be taken seriously without really addressing how we're going to shrink the financial aspect of our economy and expand the productive aspect of our economy in goods and services. And by that I mean government-provided goods and services as well as privately provided.
Well, this helps account for the right-wing rage against big government, because government is the only thing effectively that stands between ordinary people and being essentially raped by the corporations. And the corporations have a way of dealing with that. The biggest thing on Wall Street now, apparently, is the secret recordings made by a banking examiner.
Right.
What was her name?
I haven't got it in front of me.
Yeah,
But
Segura.
Taibbi writes about her in
Segura, in which these tapes show the pathetic, rather deference paid by the banking regulators to Goldman Sachs executives. A process known as regulatory capture, because people move back and forth constantly between the biggest banks and the supposed bank regulators in Washington. There are several agencies there that's supposed to deal with that. And this goes on all the time. There's supposed to be some rules preventing that, but they're completely ineffective. And this says that secret tapes made by a banking investigator examining Goldman Sachs show a culture of deference and risk aversion in which regulators were afraid to anger the very financial institutions they were supposed to be overseeing. The 46 hours of recordings of meetings and conversations come from Carmen Segura, a Harvard-trained lawyer who was hired in 2011 by the New York Federal Reserve as part of a team overhauling how the banking system was regulated after the 2008 financial crisis. Segura found a culture in which regulators were cozy with the banks they worked with and where the managers were loath to say anything or do anything that might upset them. Goldman Sachs and the New York Fed have denied Segura's allegations, of course.
Sort of what happens when your local police department begins reporting to the mafia and is taken over by the mafia, and is deferential towards the local.
Well, it's notorious in Mexico. But
Well, yeah. I mean, it's we do it at a different level in this country, at the level of the banks and the directors of the economy. At the local level, the police are able to take care of dangerous groups by themselves, so to speak.
Yeah, but which emphasizes that. I mean, when you say that the governments are furious, the Republicans are furious at the idea that government stands in the way between them and what they do in the supposedly private sector. It just emphasizes the fact that it's also that the government performs a certain function in relation to the private sector in regulating or not regulating, or regulating in a certain way when it comes to patents and copyrights and all that. The government is very much a part of this neoliberal system. It's just that it has to be kept subservient to the goals of financial capitalism as opposed to the needs of the people.
The Financial Times this morning, probably the leading business paper in the world, published in London, leads with an article about a secret hedge fund that has been manipulating the short selling that's been going on in a number of countries, including the U.S., but also Britain and Europe. The situation is a remarkable example of the sort of things that large piles of money can get away with. And they seem to be doing it with a great deal of aplomb. You're watching News from Neptune. The topic that I wanted particularly to mention today is not a problem of the domestic economy immediately, although it is finally that. It's the long term. It's a foreign policy issue that is been bubbling around in an extremely dangerous fashion for some time. I had the occasion last month to speak in a class at the University of Illinois that's being taught by the ex-congressman from this district, Timothy Johnson. And in that class, he had brought in the current congressman, Congressman Rodney Davis, recently reelected from this district, in spite of what David Green could do. And Rodney Davis, in an hour's address to students, he's talking to students at the University of Illinois, an hour address to the students, made exactly one comment about foreign policy. Most of the address was how he had friends in various parts of the state, you know. I suppose maybe the mafia principal, you know, and he'd become a friend. But in any case, the one foreign policy comment he made was, and I quote, "Vladimir Putin brings the Cold War mentality back," close quote. Now, the ignorance embodied in that comment is, in fact, not just an indication of limitations of one little congressman, but it's an indication of the extremely dangerous schemes to control the Eurasian economy by war being promoted by the Obama administration. This campaign against Vladimir Putin is not to be believed. And what we don't hear very much is what Putin himself has to say about it. There was a long and important interview with him by German television. The German media are often much better on these things. They also, at the same time, the Putin interview was being publicized in Britain. Der Spiegel, the German news magazine, had a long and interesting, in fact, interview with one of America's leading war criminals, Henry Kissinger. But this is not the sort of discussion, and it's not what we get as news in this country. What we get instead is a propaganda attack on Putin, equating him with Hitler. That's what we hear in this country. And it's amazing, because what's actually going on is a vilification of the Russian leader designed to cover over what the American leader is doing. What the American leader doing is using war and the threat of war to drive Russia out of its position in the Eurasian economy, the expansion of which the U.S. insists upon controlling. I mean, these are big issues on the table. There are serious issues on the table. One of the leading commentators on this, Stephen Cohen of The Nation magazine, has said that, you know, it's nothing short of the risk of nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia because of what the U.S. is doing, not what Putin is doing. The accounts like that of Congressman Davis about Mr. Putin are a classic example of what the psychologists call projection. Projection is the denial of a unattractive aspect of your personality by attributing it to someone else. In other words, if you have a tendency to rudeness or something, you spend your time saying, oh, well, those people around me, people are very rude, you know. Look at those rude things people are saying. Well, that's the micro level. The macro level is far more dangerous, and it's what the U.S. is doing in regard to the Russians in connection with the Ukrainian business. William Bloom, who writes an occasional column about these matters, begins his column this month by saying, Russia is invading Ukraine again and again and again and again. What he's doing is summarizing the sorts of things we get from the New York Times as well as the other major Western media about all these things that are being done in Ukraine. And it's all, at the very best, projection of the sort we're talking about. It's the U.S. which brought about the overthrow of an elected government in Ukraine. It's the U.S. that's backing the only government in Europe since the Second World War that has explicit neo-Nazis in it. And it is the U.S. which is supporting that government's attack on its dissident provinces in the eastern part of Ukraine, dissident provinces that are being supported by Russia. And Russia has insisted, Putin has insisted in the interview last week, that he will not allow this massive military campaign, Western-backed, to reduce these provinces in Ukraine that are resisting the fascist government in Kiev. So the situation is very serious, and it's the most misrepresented issue in American media, I think, since the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2003. It's an amazing mess.
Yeah.
Comments?
Yeah, well, I think Putin has in fact shown remarkable restraint in this whole situation, while making clear that he will not allow hostile power on the border of Russia. And we keep hearing this from Netanyahu, that they must Israel must have defensible borders, and this is supposed to be some kind of sacred principle. But why can't Russia say the same? But it's interesting.
If Israel only had borders, that would be progress.
Yeah, right. If we knew what they were, yeah. And why we object to altering the map in the case of Russia, but never saying a peep about it when it's done by Israel. It's curious, isn't it?
Yeah, Chomsky has pointed out that more than once, or at least once during the Cuban Missile Crisis, humanity was basically saved by a Russian deciding not to escalate the problem. And I think, in a sense, we're depending on Putin to show restraint. And I'm not following the situation in the Ukraine that closely right now, and I don't really know. I mean, I hear this bellicose language. I guess it just becomes routine after a while, and I've kind of tuned out. So it's a bit of a wake-up call, Carl, for me to hear you talk about this as the most dangerous prospect in the world right now.
I was at a party in Brooklyn a couple of weeks ago and talking to a human rights lawyer as she billed herself, and I'm not suggesting she isn't. I mean, she's an intelligent and successful young woman who was working as a lawyer on human rights issues and has turned her attention, as she was describing it to me, to human rights in Russia. And I said, oh, do you mean things like support for the Luhansk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine, or of the rights of Crimea to self-determination? She said, oh, no. I mean the suppression of human rights by President Putin that allows him to invade Ukraine and to seize Crimea. And I said, well, wait a minute. Neither of those things happened. That's Western propaganda. Oh, no, this is what's going on. Well, that was obviously not going to be a smoking social interaction, so we didn't go very far on that. But the point is that this is a perfectly intelligent and well-connected New York lawyer who is working on the issue, yes, indeed she is, as a part of this amazing propaganda campaign that we're getting right now. Propaganda campaign that's very much in support of the Obama way of making war. That is, you make war in the interests of the American 1% and pretend you aren't. You say you're not doing it. You're withdrawing from the Middle East. You are simply looking with interest at what the new revolution in Ukraine is producing. Unfortunately, Obama's cover is blown occasionally by people like Victoria Nuland, who in a famous tapped telephone call talked about exactly how the U.S. was producing its revolutionary government in Ukraine over against a popularly elected president. But the misrepresentation of an extremely dangerous situation is, as I say, at least as extreme as what happened in the Bush administration in regard to Iraq. So it's hard times, gentlemen.
This stuff appears in the media every day. Russian airplanes have been sighted over the Baltic states and are flying over, well, near the North American continent,
Right.
Still in international airspace and so on. But this is viewed as extremely ominous and provocative, but of course never so when it's American planes operating this way over Asia or near China or Russia.
There was an amusing, if that's quite the word, sidelight on this issue last week from our doofus Secretary of State, and it's the Foreign Minister of Russia, as a sign, I think, of the exasperation the Russian government is experiencing in dealing with the U.S., explained how Secretary Kerry answered him, the foreign minister, when the foreign minister complained about the belligerent comments coming from the U.S. and what the U.S. is doing in supporting the very real killing that's going on in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government, the insurgent government, the coup government, the government the U.S. backed, has killed as many people in eastern Ukraine as Israel killed in Gaza. And when the foreign minister of Russia complained to Secretary Kerry about the belligerent talk coming out of Washington, and specifically from President Obama, Kerry said, "Oh, don't pay too much attention to that. We can take care of that." Well, in a, I suppose, also undiplomatic fashion, the foreign minister of Russia told the story and said, "This is what we're getting from Washington. We're getting belligerent talk and then conversation from the state secretary that we shouldn't pay any attention to it. How can we deal with that?" says the foreign minister. Well, he has a question. He has a good question there, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think some caution is advised in this case. Russia is the one nation that has the means of defending itself. It has plenty of atomic bombs, apparently, and the missiles and long-range bombers capable of delivering them. And it's time to think seriously about this. They can't be attacked with impunity in the same way that so many other smaller nations have been.
There was a disturbing point in Pepe Escobar's column this week. Pepe Escobar is a writer for Asian Times Online. He's a Brazilian, but he is a world traveler, and he's the man, for example, who said before 9/11, who wrote in a column a year before the attacks of 9/11, 2001, that the U.S. had better be careful of Osama bin Laden, this strange Saudi who is preparing some jihadist response to the United States. He wrote that 1 year before the attacks of 9/11. Pepe spends his time finding out where the bodies are buried, and he's usually pretty good about it. He writes this week in a column entitled "Washington Plays Russian Roulette." I cannot believe how we could have gotten ourselves into the situation to protect the looters in the Ukraine that Putin would have rid the Ukraine of, and even had the gall to place in a leadership role one of the worst of the thieves. That's Peter Poroshenko, the president of the coup government in Ukraine. But that's history. What is certain is that MAD, mutually assured destruction, is not a deterrent today when both sides believe the other will use nuclear weapons once they have the advantage, and that the side that gains a decisive advantage will use them. MAD is now over. Now, Pepe Escobar here is quoting actually an American strategic planner whom he refuses not to name. But he suggests that the situation is produced by American aggression in Ukraine, which is what it is dangerous enough, in fact, to neutralize the thing that is supposed to have been preventing nuclear war for the longest time. That is, the notion each side knows the other can destroy it as well as being destroyed itself. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it does back up Stephen Cohen's comment that we're dealing with the possibility, for the first time in a long time, a real possibility of nuclear war over a foreign policy issue that 9 out of 10 Americans not only don't know about, but probably haven't even heard about it. And it is a worrisome situation. Ron, you brought the other day a copy of John Mearsheimer's article in the current number of Foreign Affairs. Mearsheimer is an American political science professor at the University of Chicago, and part of the so-called realist school that David Green has described here a couple of times for us before, probably the leading realist in American political science academia these days, and has an interesting track record. For example, he was able to demythologize a good bit of the run-up to the war in Iraq, even though Mearsheimer is no leftist by any means. He's an academic who is fully in support of American policy. But he is willing to call a spade, eh? And he did that in the run-up to the Iraq War. In this article in Foreign Affairs this month, he makes a point that the Ukraine crisis is the U.S. fault. And he puts it as U.S. fault, but what he might have said, had he wanted to follow out what exactly he did say, was that it was U.S. policy. This is for the U.S. policy that's doing it. It's not something that sort of just happened, and it is very serious indeed.
Yeah, more and more comments we're hearing from people on the ground in Ukraine about the Ukrainian army, which is suffering from the effects of corruption in the Ukrainian government, general ineptitude, and so on. They can't admit this, and they keep telling us about invasion of Russian tanks, and the Russians are amassing on the border. We keep hearing this every day. It's been going on for weeks now and months. And come on, let's get real and admit that the Ukrainian government is corrupt, incompetent, and rapidly becoming fascist. And it's raising questions about its ability to govern and to defend these supposed parts of Ukraine that Russia is looking at, and which have mostly people who are Russian-speaking and feel a greater loyalty to Russia than to Ukraine.
And it's part of the U.S. Policy, really going back to the fall of the Soviet Union, which is to march NATO and the European Union further and further east to those questionably defensible borders you were talking about, Ron. And the classic case of this comes from ex-President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, who said this week, warned again this week of the real dangers of a new Cold War, becoming, in fact, a hot war. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the discussion about the unification of Germany remained on the table, in the sense that the first Bush administration had agreed that if Germany were reunified, if the Soviet Union would not stand in the way of a reunification of Germany, and it had good reasons for standing in the way of the reunification of Germany. Been attacked twice by Germany in the 20th century and lost perhaps 20 million people or more from those attacks. If Russia wouldn't, if the USSR wouldn't stand in the way of the reunification of Germany, then, promised the first Bush administration, the U.S. would not march NATO to the Russian borders. Well, of course, as soon as Germany was reunified, the U.S. began the march of NATO to the Russian borders, which was accomplished in the Clinton administration, and the response of the U.S., remarkably enough, to the Russian objections was, we didn't sign anything. It was just a gentleman's agreement. We just said we'd do it, but, you know, we really didn't mean it. Besides, our fingers were crossed. I mean, this is the most incredible lie in recent American politics, it seems to me, and that's a tough league to play in, hey? And it's quite astonishing. But it is an example of what Russia has come to expect from the United States. In fact, the overarching construction in which the American involvement in Ukraine rests. This is quite serious indeed. We have only a few minutes left. David, did you have something else you wanted to bring up here?
Yeah, I did. Just in terms of putting this on the table, this was something I would have addressed last week if I had been here, but I wasn't feeling well. Post-Veterans Day. So, and then in fact, I think this cartoon that I'm going to show you didn't come out till Sunday, so it kind of made it put a bow on some of the things I was wanting to say, or at least issues I'm wanting to raise. It has to do with veterans and the way veterans are portrayed. It refers to an author that we've mentioned before on the program, Jerry Lemke, who is a sociologist, retired sociologist, I think, now, who did some good work on debunking the mythology of the post-Vietnam War about veterans being spat upon and writing a book about Hanoi Jane and all that. And we, of course, witnessed in the run-up to Veterans Day all of the usual, in our local newspaper, all the usual rhetoric about veterans, about how much we love them, about how much we thank, how grateful we should be to them. But lo and behold, the following Sunday after Veterans Day, we have a cartoon in the paper, which I don't know if it works, but maybe some of you read it. There's two frames, and then on the left frame it shows the unknown soldier with somebody reaching out, with several people reaching out with bouquets of flowers. And on the right, it says the known soldier, and it's a picture of a veteran on the curb, holding a sign that says homeless, suicidal, and suffering from PTSD. And then the caption that he's saying is, "Hello, anyone?" And this is referred to as the known soldier. Okay, so one of the things that Jerry Lemke has been arguing, in addition to his debunking the spitting mythology and so forth, is to talk about how veterans are framed in terms of an illness, of a mental illness and a mental trauma that is characteristic to particular wars. World War I had its shell shock. Vietnam had its PTSD, and he argues that the wars in the Middle East have their traumatic brain injury, TBI. I only raise this to say I don't believe he's trying to debunk the notion that there is PTSD or TBI. He's trying to, in a sociological and cultural context, understand what the meaning is for veterans to adopt these labels and how that has spun out over the years since Vietnam. And I guess the only comment I would make in the short time that we have is that it's really shocking after the coverage of Veterans Day to see this cartoon, because when do veterans get to speak for themselves? You either have these people that are deified as stoic heroes, or you people that are stereotyped as mentally ill. Where is the voice of those veterans who come back from the war, however affected by it, but with their mental processes in order, who analyze what has been done in whatever way, come to terms with it in whatever way they can, many of who, especially in Vietnam, but have also in terms of the Persian Gulf Wars, as all of us well know, come back, turn against the policies that sent them to the wars that they fought in. There is no voice for them. So it's really, for the News Gazette to publish this cartoon is revealing, and it kind of, as I said, put a bow for me on these arguments that Jerry Lemke, that I've been having difficulty trying to understand really where he's going with these, but now I can see it's another way of silencing veterans' voices.
Thank you, David. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 47th week of 2014, a Masking Politics edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Ron Zoke and David Green. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV includes Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with Neptuner David Johnson, and new news and comment programs that you can't hear elsewhere in CU, including Bill Press and Stephanie Miller on weekday mornings and France 24 at 1 in the morning. With more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, coming soon. And also, I should mention, on WRFU Radio, the program Living Simply, first Fridays at 8 a.m. with our own Ron Zoke. There's a new column in Smile Politely, produced by News from Neptune. And inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.